Hi guys, welcome back to week 9 of our study of the Bible. It's inspiration and it's canonization. Make sure you've got your notes in front of you, and as we start today, I want to say a few things about this series. This has been a non-traditional series as far as what I have taught in my past. Typically, I like to take books of the Bible or specific topics of the Bible and cover them in depth and use illustrations and stories and kind of make it relatable to life today. This series has been a challenge in that it has been just a ton of history. And I'm not a person who is just overly fond of history. In fact, sometimes it can be flat out boring. And so I really want to thank those of you who have made it all this way with us. I understand that at times it can be a taxing enterprise to make our way through all of this stuff, and yet there's really no way of understanding how the Bible came to be what we have today without us looking back on that history. It doesn't lend itself very well to lots of humor. It doesn't lend itself very well to lots of modern day illustrations. And so I found myself this week as I was just studying through the different versions of the Bible, thinking about how taxing it can be, and yet it's fruitful at the same time. And so today we will continue through English versions of the Bible that were created in the 20th century. And then as we get to the end of the lesson today, we'll kind of dive back into some stuff that's more maybe more interesting, more relatable, stuff that gives you some instruction on choosing versions of the Bible. And then next week will be a lot less history. In fact, it might not be any history at all, as we just try to answer a few more pressing questions about the Scriptures as we conclude. So thanks for joining us again. Again, like I said, we will be discussing today modern English versions or modern speech versions of the Bible that have come about in the 20th century. And the reason that these were necessary is because as more discoveries of ancient manuscripts became available, it became obvious that there needed to be an update to the authorized version of 1611. There were new papyrus discoveries in Egypt that gave new understanding to the Greek New Testament, that gave understanding to the Hebrew Old Testament when there were large quantities of Semitic literature that were found. And so as time went by and those things were discovered, not to mention the changing of the English language as the years went by, there just became a need for modern speech versions of the Bible that were easily understandable and easily relatable, or readable rather, to people of these generations. And so the first pioneer of modern speech Bibles is what we call the 20th century New Testament. Evidently, this Bible was created out of a concern to make the Bible more understandable for young people. The completest version was published in 1904 in both London and New York. And the preface states that the purpose of the translation was to enable Englishmen to read the most important part of the Bible in that form of their own language, which they themselves use. Now, what was novel about this version of the New Testament is that it printed its books in chronological order, with brief introductions before each one. It wasn't a complete Bible, it was just the New Testament, but it was the first modern speech translation of the New Testament that we have. One of the scholars who was consulted from time to time on the 20th century New Testament was a man named Richard Weymouth. Weymouth was a scholar who had published his own Greek New Testament in 1862. And when he retired, he decided that he was going to translate his Greek New Testament into modern English. It was originally titled The New Testament and Modern Speech, but it has since come to be known as Weymouth's Bible or Weymouth's New Testament. But both of those Bibles, the 20th century New Testament and the Weymouth New Testament, were eclipsed by the translation of a Scotsman named James Moffat. Moffat was educated in Glasgow, and he published the Historical New Testament in 1901, for which St. Andrews University awarded him a Doctor of Divinity degree. But while at Oxford in 1913, he published the first edition of his New Testament. It was called a New Translation. It was not a revision of his earlier work, but it was a new translation. He completed the Old Testament in 1924, and they were printed together in 1928 in America under the title A New Translation of the Bible. Moffat's version became so popular that in the years between the two world wars, when people spoke of a modern speech version of the Bible, they were generally referring to Moffat. Certainly, however, the King James Version was still the most popular Bible. And when Moffat gave lectures, he would cite 3 reasons as to why he thought the King James Version was no longer satisfactory. The first reason he thought it was no longer satisfactory was because of its archaic language. He thought that the language of the King James was becoming too archaic for the modern reader to understand and grasp in fullness. The second reason was the advance that was made in the study of the vocabulary of the Hebrew and the Greek since 1611. And so with different manuscripts and documents available to them, there had been increases made in understanding the Greek and the Hebrew, and so he thought those lent themselves to a new version. And finally, the third version was new manuscript evidence that might not necessarily have been scriptural, but was manuscript evidence of the Hebrew and Greek from those many years ago that lent evidence as to what words should and should not mean. Well, what made the Moffat Bible so popular was the freshness of its language. Consider his translation of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the chapter we know as the love chapter. Moffat's version says, "Love makes no parade, gives itself no airs, is never rude, never selfish, never irritated, never resentful. Love is never glad when others go wrong. Love is gladdened by goodness, always slow to expose, always eager to believe the best, always hopeful, always patient." Well, by this time, English-speaking Bible readers were getting used to these modern speech versions, and there were many independent efforts to translate the Bible into current English, more than really we have time to mention here. But just like Protestants were beginning to use modern speech translations, so too the Catholics would get a version of their own. It would be known as the Knox Translation. In 1939, the Catholic hierarchy granted Ronald Knox of Oxford permission to translate the New Testament from the Latin Vulgate into modern English. Now, he was a brilliant student of the classics, and he was a writer of many different types of prose and detective novels. And at age 29, he converted to Catholicism. And in 1939, he began to apply his literary skills to the translation of the New Testament in English. This translation was published in 1945. He would eventually publish the Old Testament as well in 1949. And while it's a brilliant piece of translation, it suffers from the fact that it's a translation of a translation. In other words, he translated it from the Latin Vulgate. He didn't translate it from the original Hebrew and Greek. And since Catholics, about the time when Knox finished his work, were given the freedom to translate from the original Hebrew and Greek, other versions have since eclipsed the Knox translation, especially in America. I'll mention only the most popular and influential one. It's called the Jerusalem Bible. It is the first complete Catholic Bible translated into English from the original languages. Previously, all translations in the Catholic Church were made from the Latin Vulgate. It's called the Jerusalem Bible because it owes its inception to the Dominican School of Bible and Archaeology in Jerusalem. The English version of the Jerusalem Bible was printed in 1966. And among the notable people working on that translation was J.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings. Now, one noteworthy element of the Jerusalem Bible is that it uses the name Yahweh instead of the alternative Jehovah or Lord. The English is of high quality, so much so that many Protestants use it with great profit. Here's a sampling of the Jerusalem Bible from Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Do not model yourselves on the behavior of the world around you, but let your behavior change, modeled by your new mind. This is the only way to discover the will of God and know what is good, what it is that God wants, what is the perfect thing to do. Well, during World War II, there was a man named J.B. Phillips who was in charge of a flourishing group of young people in southeast London. And he used to read selections from Paul's epistles at the close of their meetings, which was called Youth Club. But these were unchurched kids. And Phillips' desire to make the biblical books comprehensible to these young people stimulated him to make fresh translations of Paul's letters and read those. Now, Phillips would eventually write a New Testament, and it's really a paraphrase. That in itself is a discussion that we could have, as one could say, well, every version is a paraphrase. And in some sense, they would be right, because there's not an exact perfect translation for every Greek or Hebrew word moving to the English. But while accurate translations try to get as close to the original wording as possible, paraphrases are more concerned with relatability or readability. And what's most interesting about Phillips's version of the Bible is that C.S. Lewis received a copy of it when Phillips wrote to him and asked him for a critique. He enclosed his book of Colossians to C.S. Lewis, and Lewis replied and said, "Thank you 100 times. I thought I knew Colossians pretty well, but your paraphrase makes it far more significant. It was like seeing a familiar picture after it's been cleaned. I hope very much you will carry out your plan of doing all the epistles." And so Phillips followed that advice, and in 1947 there appeared the Letters to the Young Churches with an introduction by C.S. Lewis. In 1952, Phillips completed the Gospels, and in 1955 completed the book of Acts. In 1957, he completed Revelation, and in 1958, the entire Phillips New Testament version was published. For people who have not grown up in the church and who are interested in reading the New Testament, Phillips' version is certainly one of the best. C.S. Lewis would go on to say, "If this book had come into my hands when I first seriously began to try and discover what Christ was, it would have saved me a great deal of labor." Well, if we try and discuss all the English versions that have been created in the 20th century, we would probably have to expand this series about 4 weeks, and I'm not going to do that. What I will do then is I'll talk about the ones that have been the most noteworthy. There have been 2 major revisions of the authorized version of 1611. We've already discussed both of them. The Revised Version of 1881 and the American Standard Version of 1901. Both of these versions tried to preserve the language of the King James as much as possible, but by the middle of the 20th century, these versions just seemed a bit archaic. It seemed as though they needed some revision themselves. For instance, if you read 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 3, it says, "And in covetousness shall they with feigned words make merchandise of you." Well, you know innately that that is not modern English. So in 1937, a revision of the American Standard began that was to express the best translation of the Scriptures in English designed for both public and private use, while preserving what it could of the language of the King James Version. The result was the RSV, or the Revised Standard Version, published in 1952. As the modernization of the English was one of the main purposes of this revision, it made changes to words like these. Saith became says in the Revised Standard Version. Sinneth became sins. It got rid of the thous and these and the thys and the thines, except where God is addressed. It also eliminated the word ye for the second person plural, which means that there's no way to distinguish between the singular and the plural you in the English version. Now that's kind of important in translating the scriptures, and I'll give you one example and show you why. In Luke chapter 22, verses 31 to 32, we read that Jesus says, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail." Now the first two "yous" in that verse are actually plural, and the third is singular, but you would never know that by reading the English translation. There were other changes also, like reverting to the word Lord instead of Jehovah. Now, the Revised Standard Version received a pretty mixed response initially, but over time it's proven to be very popular. It sold 12 million copies in its first 10 years, and although it's a Protestant version, it has been officially approved by the Catholic Church as well, because a version including the Apocrypha was printed in 1957. F.F. Bruce, an author and scholar who I've leaned on considerably in this series, says of the Revised Standard Version, "For the English-speaking world as a whole, there is no modern version of the Bible which comes so near as the RSV does to making the all-purpose provision which the Authorized Version made for so many years." Author Robert Mounts says, "It is the best translation in the English language for general use." Well, the Revised Standard Version fell in a long line of Bibles that began with William Tyndale as its foundation. Almost every English Bible is a revision of some previous existing English version. But the New English Bible abandoned this tradition. The New English Bible is not a revision, but it's an entirely new translation. So in 1946, the year of the New Testament of the Revised Standard Version, the year that was published, plans were made in Britain to produce the New English Bible. It was a project comprised of many different denominations. The complete Bible was printed in 1970, and it was translated directly to English from the Hebrew and Greek, and it's a very high water mark for biblical translation. There are a few other Bibles that I want to mention before we're done today, all of which are commonly used in today's modern era. The first that I want to talk about is the New American Standard. The Lockman Foundation, which was a nonprofit Christian corporation of La Habra, California, published the Gospel of John in 1960. This was followed by the Gospels in 1962, the New Testament in 1963, and the entire Bible in 1971. It is known now as the New American Standard Bible, or the New American Standard Version. The Lockman Foundation did this because they were concerned that the American Standard Version of 1901, which they said was a monumental product of applied scholarship, assiduous labor, and thorough procedure, they were concerned it was fast disappearing from the Bible scene. And so they felt called to rescue that version from extinction. And so a group of 16 men went to work on this project. The twofold purpose was, one, to adhere to the original languages of the Bible, and two, to obtain a fluent, readable style of current English. Now, the New American Standard Bible is a conservative and somewhat literal approach to Bible translation. While it will never be the most popular Bible, it's really good as a study Bible. I know I know many ministers who use the New American Standard as a study Bible, and I have one myself. F.F. Bruce says of it, "If the Revised Standard Version had never appeared, this revised version of the American Standard would be a more valuable work than it is. As things are, there are a few things done well by the New American Standard Bible, which are not done better by the Revised Standard Bible." And so while it's not the most popular, it's still widely used among evangelicals in America. It is often referred to as the most literal translation we have in English today, and is often used by ministers and clergy, again, as study Bibles. Well, a different kind of Bible was printed in 1971 by a man named Kenneth Taylor. Taylor is the author of what we call the Living Bibles. For years, he had felt the need of having a Bible in modern, understandable English. He noticed that whenever he would conduct family worship, his children were sometimes baffled by the archaic language of the King James Version, and so he tried to explain the passages in simple, everyday English in a way that they could understand. Well, this led to his first attempt to produce a book. It's really a paraphrase of a book, and he did this while he was riding the commuter train between his home in Wheaton, Illinois, and his office in Chicago, where he worked for Moody Press. So in 1959, Moody published Taylor's Book of Romans for the Children's Hour. This was followed in 1962 with what Taylor would call the Living Letters, but he couldn't get a publisher for these. And so he printed 2,000 copies on his own, and he took them to a Christian booksellers convention. He wasn't having much success until 1963, when a preacher named Billy Graham, who was confined to a hospital in Hawaii, read Taylor's Living Letters on television and ordered 50,000 copies for his television audience. That demand blew Taylor away, and the response was so overwhelming that Taylor would eventually leave Moody Press, and he would begin his own firm called the Tyndale House Publishing Firm. In 1965, he published the Living Prophecies. He published the Living Gospels in 1957, and he finally completed the first printed Living Bible in 1971. Taylor's goal had been to paraphrase, and the basic text for this was the American Standard Version. Now, of course, it received scathing reviews, especially from those in academia, but it has sold tens of millions of copies, and it serves as the basis for the New Living Translation, which is extremely popular today, and which is the version that Randy uses during our worship services on Sunday morning. Well, in the 1950s, some evangelical scholars who were acutely aware of the archaic language of the King James Version, they began to envision a modern speech version of the Bible that would do in its age what the King James Version did for its own time. It was to be a version that could be used in public worship as well as private study and also for memorization. So in 1965, representatives of a number of denominations met and agreed that there was still a need for a good Bible version of contemporary English. And when the New York Bible Society agreed to sponsor that version financially, the project began. Dr. Edwin Palmer was the chairman of a group of 15 scholars who governed this project, and around 100 scholars were invited to participate in the translation. Originally, it was going to be called a contemporary translation, but as some of the translators lived in Canada and England and Australia and New Zealand, the version eventually became known as the New International Version. The initial translation of each book was the work of a small team of scholars who met in places that were convenient to them, and then they submitted their work to an intermediate editorial committee. Then it went to stylists and other critics from all walks of life for review and for suggestions. And eventually, the New Testament of the New International Version was published in 1973. And then in 1978, the Old Testament was published along with the New. Well, a version of the Bible is always judged on its faithfulness to the original text and its readability. The NIV did very well with both of these. It is accurate, it is clear. And today, the New International Version is the best-selling version of the Bible. And it's one of the best all-purpose Bibles available to English-speaking Christians. It has been the preferred translation in terms of being sold. It has been the best-selling translation for a majority of evangelicals over several decades now. For an idea of the popularity and use of Bibles today, let's take a look at the best-selling list. The best-selling Bibles in 2018, according to the Evangelical Christian Publishers Association, were, of course, the New International, which I already mentioned, The second best-selling book was the King James Version. The third was the English Standard Version. The fourth was the New Living Translation. And the fifth was the Christian Standard Bible, or you might know it as the Holman Christian Standard Bible. But best-selling doesn't necessarily mean the most read. Also in 2018, the Barna Group did a study of the most read Bibles of that year, and the results were much different. As you can see from this chart, the most read Bible by a wide margin is still the King James Version, followed at a distance by the New International Version, and then in third is the English Standard Version. And so, with all the Bibles that we have discussed, how do you choose a version to read today? There are really three different types of Bibles, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. Many people think today that a faithful translation of the Bible means a word-for-word translation. That if the original one has a noun, then its translation has a noun. And if the original has 16 words, they don't want to see 17 in the translation, they want to see 16. And so the first type of Bible is what we would call a word-for-word translation. This is also known as formal equivalence. Bibles that come to mind when I think of that are the King James Version, the American Standard, the New American Standard. Like, those come closest to this ideal. But anyone who's learned a second language knows that a word-for-word translation is impossible much or most of the time. There are idioms, there are colloquialisms, there are all kinds of things that make a word-for-word translation impossible. Even the King James Version translators realize this. In a couple of places in the King James Version in the Old Testament, the Hebrew text literally reads, God's nostrils enlarged. But the King James Version translates that as God became angry, which is what the expression means, right? In Matthew chapter 1, verse 18, the King James Version says that Mary was found to be with child. But the Greek is quite different and quite graphic. It says Mary was having it in the belly. That's how the original Greek says it. In many places in Paul's letters, the King James Version reads, God forbid. But the original has neither God nor forbid. Literally, it says, may it never be, as most modern translators render it. And then the second version is what we would call a thought-for-thought translation, or some might call it a phrase-for-phrase translation, which is known as dynamic equivalence, or more recently as functional equivalence. A dynamic equivalence translation is not as concerned with the grammatical form of the original language as it is with the meaning of the original language. It allows more room for interpretation, and it's easier to understand. The New International Version, the New English Bible, would be examples of this philosophy. And then thirdly, we have paraphrases. And these are much less interested in the structure in words and in accuracy as they are interested in how things might be conveyed or expressed today. Those would be versions like the Message. And so let's look at the difference in those, right? We're going to look at Romans chapter 1, verse 16 in three different translations. The first we're going to look at is the English Standard, which probably comes closest in these that we'll look at to being a word-for-word translation. Romans 1:16 and the English Standard says this, For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. So now we'll read Romans 1:16 in a dynamic equivalence version, which would be like the New International. And so in the New International Version, Romans 1:16 says, For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. So you can see that there's been some change there, right? They've changed the word Greek to Gentile to convey the idea that these are people who are not Jewish. So now let's look at Romans 1:16 in a paraphrase. We'll look at the Message. It says, It's news I'm most proud to proclaim, This extraordinary message of God's powerful plan to rescue everyone who trusts him, starting with the Jews and then right on to everyone else. Well, obviously here there's very little resemblance to the original wording, but rather the author is trying to convey his understanding of what Paul was trying to communicate. And so which version should you choose? Well, that's really depends on you. In the end, my encouragement to you would be to try and pick out one that's more word for word. So for instance, I use 3 different Bibles. I use the New American Standard, specifically when I'm studying something. I use the New International Version and the English Standard Version for common use. Probably my most favorite version today is the English Standard Version. But I like to use the New International Version with my teenagers, and so I use several different Bibles. But the important thing is that you pick a version and you stick with it, and the most important thing is that you're reading it. How tragic would it be for us to spend 10 weeks in this study without developing a consistent habit of spending time in God's Word? You'll find all kinds of things that will bless you. Just yesterday, I was reading through 2 Chronicles as I read through the Bible again this year. And in 2 Chronicles, I came across a verse in chapter 20 that I'd never read, and that was a real blessing to me. In that passage, there's a large opposing army that is about to come and attack Israel. And the king of Israel, Jehoshaphat, knows that his army is no match for the opposing army that is encroaching upon him. And so, in chapter 20, he begins to pray. And at the end of that prayer, he says this. He says, "We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you." And that verse blessed me because I feel that way a lot today. In so many situations that we're facing today, I find myself thinking, Lord, I don't know what to do, but I'm going to keep my eyes on you. Well, be in the Word. Your Word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path, we read. Hebrews 4 tells us that the Word of God is living and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates, even dividing soul and spirit, joint and marrow. It judges the thoughts and the attitudes of the heart. Romans 10:17 says, faith comes from hearing, and hearing from the Word of God. And so whether you're reading a formal equivalence Bible or a dynamic equivalence Bible or even a paraphrase, be reading it, be in it, be studying it. Let it dwell in your heart and in your mind as you try and maneuver these unique times in history. I look forward to joining you for one more week next week. Until then, be safe. God bless. We love you.